Jim Howard here in Fort Worth, Texas.
Thank you very much for watching.
Hello, Jim Howard here in Fort Worth, Texas. Today's date, it's June 14th of 2020. I would sort of, well, I don't want to make work for myself, but I would sort of like interesting questions, or I guess I'd like different questions. I don't get a lot of questions asked on, well, I don't have a lot of subscribers. Well, I have, 3,500 subscribers, I think. But I guess I don't get the kind of questions I maybe would like to, where I could tell a story or something. So I may try, I've thought of this in the past. So what I'm going to do is, I read, and I've answered a few, very few. I mean, for years I've been reading the questions and answers on this site. And and I've learned a lot. And I remember just about the first years and years ago, the first question that probably wasn't the first, but that got me interested. Somebody asked a question about rich people that have, fancy, credit cards. And I remember somebody asked, was there really such thing as a gold credit card? And but I don't think that was the first question that I read, but it was in that group. I remember somebody somebody asked, like, when somebody who has a lot of money, somebody's rich, when they go to, out to eat or something like that, do they have to use, their credit card? Do they have to, whatever? And this guy that answered the question said that he worked, and he kind of explained, of course he didn't give the name, he mentioned that he worked for somebody who had a lot of money, and that he was, I forget whether he was exactly what his title would have been, except, he took care of everything for this guy. So he said, when the guy was going out to eat, with a date or wife, or I don't know, I forget for the details, this guy took care of everything. So, knew what restaurant the guy was going to. I guess he went to the restaurant with him, but didn't sit at the table, and he took care of everything, so there was nobody coming over, leaving a bill or anything else. This guy took care of all that kind of stuff. So I started reading these questions and answers, and eventually some came up that I actually answered. And like I said, I'm guessing that maybe I've answered 10 questions over the years that have been asked where I put some input into it. But I would kind of like, so what I'm going to do, I guess, is use these, if I remember to do it, is when I see an interesting question, I'll answer it, here on this. This one is, as a cop, how did your first traffic stop go? And this guy said, I had this encounter shortly after I got out of the police academy. And then he talks about a early form of radar, I guess, something like radar, I guess. And so I was a hospital security officer for many years. And then I moved to a small town, and there was a even smaller town right next to it. And I had never applied to be a reserve police officer with the town, but until I moved to that smaller, with my wife and family. I'd been in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was working security in Kansas City, Missouri. Had a private officer's commission through, private officer's commissioning unit or whatever. And you're going to find this hard, if you're in a lot of other states or whatever, you're going to find this hard to believe. But Missouri did not have like a state agency that controlled security officers, night watchmen, security officers who, transported money in armored cars. They didn't have any state laws regarding that. Long story, having to do with the history of Missouri. Pendergast, a city boss back then. There was a lot of those, and this type of stuff that went on. So, and he hired who, he told the police department, this Pendergast, he, made money, and now, he wasn't a mafia. I don't think you wouldn't call, he wasn't mafia, at all. And I'm not sure how corrupt he was. Well, he was corrupt, but, people went to him and said, sir, I'd like to work for the police department. And if I guess somehow he made it, okay. Okay, I'm not trying to do an Italian ad. He was Italian. He would let him know that, okay, well, if you owe me, I'm going to give you this job with the police department, and you're indebted to me. And I guess it was probably, and I expect you to vote, for the candidate that I tell people to vote for, and stuff like that. So he would take his business card and he would write on it in a certain color and then give it to the guy, and then the guy would go over to the police department and they'd look at the business card with the certain colored ink on it and everything, and the guy would get a job as a police officer. Same with the fire department, everything. That's the way it went. At some point, the state of Missouri passed something, and it took the police department for Kansas City, Missouri, and put it under more or less state control. And the way they did it was, as I understand it, a board of police commissioners, where before Pendergast could just, they had a board of police commissioners, and maybe one of the police commissioners was somebody from Kansas City, Missouri, but maybe none of them were, and the rest were other people who, and that's the way. So I don't know, 30, 40 years later, when, that's the way it stayed. And I left in 2000, the Kansas City, Missouri. I left Missouri in 2000, and it still was the same procedure. You would think that the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department was, it was a good police department, I mean, I'm sure there was some bad stuff, but it was a good police department. I didn't work for them. But I was commissioned through the private officers commissioning unit of the Kansas City, Missouri, police department. And that was, through the board of, police commissioners. And because of that, the way it was set up was like different than other states because of this whole political situation. Like I worked years later I worked in Florida. And in Florida, let's see, where was I working? Anyway, I worked security in Florida, and I worked in Orlando, and I worked security, private security, and I worked in Miami. And in the state of Florida, a security officer has really basically just about zero ability to legally do anything. In fact, and I don't know how much this is in other states. I think Florida might be the only one. A security officer cannot even make a private citizen's arrest. Now, I'm sure if you were not, I'm guessing, it never came up. I'm guessing that when you were not working security and you were, at home or someplace else, if something came up, you saw a crime being committed or something happening, you could make a citizen's arrest. But when you were working as a security officer, and I was working in Miami, a shopping mall, a big mall, and you had no authority to make an arrest, zero, period. Now, of course you could detain somebody, but it was a well, it didn't cause a problem for me, but I think I could see where it probably did cause a lot of problems. So back to Missouri or whatever. Security officers there, because of this state, because of the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department being under state control. Now, I don't think people even knew, in the beginning they probably did, but by the time the Board of Police Commissioners was set up, and I don't know how many people were on. Well, I guess I should have known because I went to a meeting that they had as Board of Police Commissioners, and they were up there, I'm guessing 5. Of course, maybe there was 7. And I went there to just see, because the Board of Police Commissioners was changing the thing for security officers. And they wanted input about should they require X amount of training for security officers, and should the security officers go to the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department range to qualify, or could they continue to go to a private range and get their certification that way. And I didn't intend to get involved, and I just went to see how it went. And by the way, at that point, I had for about a year, my own security patrol service. I was basically the only one working. For a while, I had somebody that I hired, to patrol, because I was
although the wife helped me, she wasn't able to go to business. And nobody ever. We ran an ad in the local paper. You know, not every week. It was a weekly paper. I forget. You know, showed a badge. You know, Merchant Security Service, arrest vandalism or something like that. And then, you know, said, you know, we're not your local police department, which is, you know, I forget how I had it worded, you know, which, you know, does a great job and all that kind of, but we're a private security service, and we can do the following for you, you know, check on your house while you're out of town, things like, you know, things like that, things that were not, because I didn't want to piss off the police department or anything. That didn't stop me from getting arrested years later by a local police department. You know. But I'll go into that sometime. I've never mentioned that. But anyway, I went to this board meeting, and even the hospital that I work for, well, all the hospitals, their director of security, they had a group that met, you know, the Greater Kansas City Hospital Security Directors Association or something like that, and they'd get together, and even they had kicked in to hire a lawyer. They kicked in with all the other companies that had, you know, in order to stop the Board of Police Commissioners from requiring security officers to get their training just from them, you know, with not have the police department have any hand in it at all. And the police department was, you know, saying, well, we ought to have a day's training or something, you know. It was minuscule, you know. And we did get, training, you know, different kinds of training through our private companies. And the other thing was that we would go to the police department range to be, you know, certified in firearms. And the hospital, or all the companies, Pinkerton, Burns, Wells Fargo, you know, all of them, and all the private companies that, you know, that had, whether it was armored car companies or no matter, all of them got this lawyer chipped in, including the company that I worked for at that time, Trinity Lutheran Hospital. You know, to prevent that, because they didn't want to have to, you know, pay extra, and whatever. So anyway, the place was filled. I'm not sure how many people, 100, several hundred, and just happened a guy sitting next, and I had a private security service for about a year. Okay, let's see. Something I should mention too, I think, is because of Missouri and because of this thing that they had put into effect, having control of the police departments. Now I don't know about St. Louis, Missouri. This is Kansas City, Missouri. But I mean, it was a state law, so I'm not sure in St. Louis if they had a board of, I'm not sure how it worked there. But for Kansas City, Missouri, if you were a night watchman, a security officer, whatever you were licensed by the Private Officers Commissioning Unit, which was part of the thing underneath the and so now there'll be a whole bunch of people who are going to say bullshit, you know, I'm sorry, you know, you're wrong. There's going to be people. The way the Private Officers Commissioning Unit had everything set up is that private security officers had full police power on the property that they were protecting, and they could make arrest, but if it was something, if you're making an arrest, then you'd have to have the Kansas City, Missouri police come. We couldn't lock somebody up in our hospital. So you would have to call the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. They would come, and you would go to court. The security officer would go to court, and they even had a directive out to in the police department rules and regulations. You're probably tired of. Can I? Nah. No, I'll just leave it like this. Next time I'll set it up where. But anyway, so even the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, for their officers, in their standing orders or whatever, it was, when a private security officer makes an arrest, you will make the court date. This is to the officers, Kansas City, Missouri police officer. You will make the court date. You will pick up, you take into custody and take the person to, the city jail and whatever was necessary. But you won't go to court unless, I don't know if they spelled out, if it was a murder. We had a murder at an employee at the hospital I worked at, Trinity Lutheran Hospital, that he worked at the hospital in surgery as a employee who transported patients, went up the floor and would bring them down to surgery. Then when surgery was done, he would, take them back to their rooms or in a recovery room or wherever. And I had been working for years on the second shift as a supervisor, and I wanted to work day shift. And so I'd gone to the day shift. And then this guy worked the day shift, so when I worked second shift, I wasn't seeing him. But then I saw this guy, and then I asked the other security officers, I said, what about this guy, and, described him. And I said, what's the deal with him? Well, what do you mean? And I said, well, every time I see him, he looks at me like he wants to fucking kill me. Have we put a ticket on? No. We haven't had any problem? No. So, so a week or so later, still the same thing. I asked the guy, the day shift, other guys, on the day shift, again, about this guy. What's the deal with this guy? No, nothing, And it took a while, but then eventually it turns out this guy even left the hospital for lunch or something and went like a half a block or maybe a block away to you could see it from the hospital parking lot, 31st and Main. Hospital was up kind of high, and you could from the parking lot or from the windows, you could see the adult bookstore there and other across the street, and a couple of places that were entertainment that were popular. One was males, dressed up as women, and that was a very popular place, I guess, for people to want to go and see and drink. Anyway, he, on his lunch or break or whatever, he left the hospital property, went across the street. There was two guys working in the adult bookstore. He robbed the adult bookstore and he killed both of the people. And that was like his MO when he would rob someplace. Luckily, he didn't rob a movie theater place or someplace else. He would kill. He didn't leave anybody alive. And finally the police got him, and they arrested him after he left the hospital for some reason. Maybe he had better control, over him and whatever. But because our hospital, before I went to work at that hospital, there had been a shootout in the hospital. The guy who was in charge of not the doctor, but the department head for respiratory therapy, was wanted by the police, by the Marshal Service. And I don't think you make their list or whatever unless, you know. And so the police went there to arrest him, and there was a shootout, and I can't remember now. I wasn't working there. I was working at a hospital a few blocks away. But a police officer, I'm not sure if it was a police officer or a U.S. Marshal, or who was shot actually by him. Turned to the hospital, and he was a department head. By the time I came to work there, they had a tremendous, probably the best respiratory therapy department in Kansas City, Missouri. They had a great guy that was in charge of the department, and they had the best employees in the respiratory therapy department. And I hadn't heard about the shootout or anything at all like that. And finally, I found out about it. But and by the way, the other hospital I was working at, we had a elderly couple come in, and the lady's husband was admitted through the ER, but didn't have, was arranged it, was come through, and it was a weekend, I guess, Saturday, Sunday, and maybe a Sunday, I think. The admitting department usually, in that case, they encourage people, don't bring money or valuables to the hospital. If you do come in and you get admitted or whatever, have your family take them home, the valuables home. And anyway, this couple comes in, and the ER admitting clerk, although this patient was being admitted up to the, said, "Do you have any valuables?" "Yes, we have X amount of money," or something like that. "Well, what you need to do is, take it home with you." No, we're gonna keep it, or I don't know exactly how the conversation went. Anyway, the patient went upstairs, and I'm not sure if it was the next day. I don't remember now, But the patient had a breathing treatment from respiratory therapy, and the person left. And then right away, a man shows up and goes to the room, and had on a white jacket or whatever, and said he was there. And the man's wife said, "Well, he just got his breathing treatment." And the guy said, "Well, the doctor wants this other given Adderall, or I forget what it was. It was a the name of a thing that people take for breathing." She said, "Oh, okay." And he says, "I'd like for you to step outside." And she said, "Well, they always let me stay." And he says, "Well, I'd rather you stand outside." And she said, "Okay," and went outside. Then he immediately came out and left. And she goes in, and then she immediately checked for the money, and it was gone. Okay, that guy, we found out later, was the lady who asked down at the emergency admitting desk. That was his wife, and he was the guy over at Trinity Lutheran Hospital that was wanted and who shot it out with the police. So I got sidetracked, so back to the well, I never got around to even asking. I went into too many stories. I wanted to make this a short. Okay, let me do this, and next time I won't do this whole rigmarole of telling you, I'll just answer the question. As a cop, how was your first traffic stop? Oh, okay. The first one you made. I had been a hospital and was a hospital security officer for altogether 30 years. At this point, I just moved out of Kansas City, Missouri. I never tried to become a reserve officer with the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department because I saw that there would be, in my opinion, a conflict, with me being commissioned by the Private Officers Commissioning Unit of the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department and working as a security officer and having full police powers, even the ability to, legal ability to do a hot pursuit, which that would be that was unusual, but that's the way it worked there. In fact, because of that situation, because of the situation where that was set up, because of Kansas City Police Department being so corrupt years and years ago, and this was put into effect to try to stop the corruption, and apparently it worked, because Kansas City, Missouri Police Department had a very good police department at that time, and I'm guessing probably still does. But I never attempted to become a reserve officer with the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, and I didn't think that they would allow that. So, but when I moved to this new place, new city, Belton, Missouri, a small police department, but a good one, by the way. I did apply with the Belton Police Department, and the chief of police came back and said, no, he called me, personally, and said, no, yeah, I'm sorry, you can't, or whatever, and he said, that's because you're a, security officer, or whatever, and I said, well, I'm a security officer in Kansas City, Missouri. I wouldn't have any security or out here. No, you can't do it. And I said, oh, okay. So there was a small police department, Raymore, Missouri, and they had 0 police officers. They had, at that time, they might have had in the past 7 or more reserve officers. But when I applied, they had 6, police officers, 1 patrolled each night. And I had to go through their training. I didn't have to go to the police academy. I just had to go through their training. And basically it was riding with one of the reserve officers for X amount of hours, or that was about it. And so and sometimes those officers, reserve officers, they didn't go in, and they never had a schedule, so I'd go over to ride with an officer, and he wouldn't show up. Now, I could have contacted him ahead of time and said, I wanted to check, I thought I'd ride with you, but I never did that. I'd just go, and a lot of times I'd show up and no officer went on duty, so I just went back home. Eventually I got the number of required hours in, and then was informed that and I could, the other officers all patrol one night a week that they liked, and it actually worked out good for me and for them. I had at that point Mondays and Tuesdays off where I was working, the hospital that I was working at, and so I picked Sunday, and then of course it was totally up to me what time I went in and what time I went, and since I was off Monday, I stayed, later. A lot of the other guys, had to work a day shift or something, so they might knock off at 11 o'clock, or they might knock off at, whatever. And I stayed late, and, I went in and early, and I stayed late on Sunday and patrolled. So anyway, I go in, I've been informed, you can now, and I went in and took out the patrol car, and of course I was the, only one on duty. And I know how things are, I know how people are, and all that kind of stuff, and I thought, please, don't let something bad happen, that's going to make me look like an idiot, or, something's going to, although I had a tremendous amount of, because I'd been working hospital security for, a whole bunch of years. And, let's see, 4, 5, at least 9 hours and more, actually. I was working at another hospital. Let's see, wait a minute. Yeah. I don't know how many, but I had a lot of experience. But I went in and I was telling myself, okay, don't mess up, because I knew all the reserve officers, and they were all really nice guys. And they didn't have the experience that I had, but they were, they were nice guys. And I mean, of course, they had the experience of knowing, Raymore, Missouri, the town, and stuff like that. But so I was just telling myself, I don't want to mess up and do something, do something stupid, have me end up looking like a dumbass, because then for the rest of your life, they're gonna say, So I was patrolling, and everything was going okay, and I want to make it through the night. Then I got a call from our dispatch that there was a car out on J Highway, which was slightly out of the city limits, that was reported broke down in the middle of the highway or something. And so I headed over that way. I came to, and of course the city manager, had told all the reserve officers of Raymore, Missouri, that we were never to go outside the city limits. We were never to assist somebody outside the city limits. And there was argument and disagreement. I kind of kept my mouth shut. I was new. They said, well, what if there's a lady on the right out, can we help her? Or a car broke down. She's, the city limits is here, and we can see her over there. The city manager, no. Of course, the guys went ahead and did, But I came to the city, and the big old hill. I came to the city limits, and then I went up come down the hill, and there it was. Car just totally smashed to pieces. And I pulled up, and a female and a young male came over to the vehicle, and I said, anybody hurt? And the young man said, my brother's dead. He's dead. And I immediately got on the radio call, and by the way, the dispatcher for the Raymore Police Department at that time was a reserve person, somebody who volunteered and came in, and they were really nice too. But right away I called in and I told the dispatcher, send everything you got. And it was kind of funny because, well, not funny, the first helicopter had just come to Kansas City, the contract and the whole thing. And the hospital had a helicopter. And the helicopter people were going around to different communities, bringing in their helicopter at the fire department and explaining to the fire department how to get the, helicopter to come and the whole procedures. And they had just, for the Raymore, our little town, they had just come out not long ago and brought in the helicopter and showed them and told them when to call, how to handle the landings, watching out for power lines and all that, taught them all that kind of stuff, or passed on the information to them. And the helicopter hadn't been called. In fact, I don't think the helicopter had been called any place. Maybe it had, but it was like brand new. And I told the dispatcher, send everything that, and of course all the city had was a fire district. So they actually covered an area outside of also the city, outside of the city. It wasn't a city, it was a state fire district. But anyway, the dispatcher handled it great. He handled it, so right away, as soon as I called, and I get out of the vehicle and go over and check on the brother. It was this guy's brother who was up walking around, and then I realized, I'd had a little bit, hadn't had my EMT, I hadn't done my EMT training or whatever, but I'd been working hospital security and everything, and I knew, an accident that bad that this kid walking around. I was trying to get him, lay down and whatever, and he wouldn't. And then I was thinking, oh my God, this is a fatality accident. I'm going to have to write the report. I've written, and I was thinking, I've written a lot of accident reports on hospital property, but never a fatality accident, never one this serious. And I knew, those reports need to be, they're going to end up in court, they're going to end up everywhere, and it's going to, and I thought, God damn, And then, and of course some cars, I had traffic stopped, on this road, which was not traveled a lot, but it seemed like that night there was a bunch. And I was thinking, oh God, why me? And then I see this person coming in uniform. His car was stopped in traffic. Well, he'd been dispatched there, of course. He'd heard the radio calls, I'm sure. It was a highway patrol, and then I see him. He looked like he was like 16 years old, and then I realized, oh, I'm outside of the city limits. This officer has to write that report. So, but then I had to go, then the helicopter, the fire department shows up, the helicopter shows up, coroner shows up, and then I was called on by, the people there, they called the dispatcher, my dispatcher, and told me I needed to go over and tell the family, Mom and Dad, that their son was being transported to St. Joseph Hospital. And they gave me the address in Raymore. So I drove over and, pulled up and went up and knocked on the door. And of course, that small town, seemed like just about everybody had a scanner, and they would call. This before 911. They would hear this. They would hear our siren. If we turned our siren on to do a car stop or something like that, The mayor would have his scanner running, and that was bad. And they'd had a thing in the past where there was a fatality accident or whatever, and the dispatcher was trying to get hold of a minister that he knew, a small town. He knew that this family went to such and such a church and everything. He was trying to call. He was doing other stuff that he needed to do, but he was trying to call out and get hold of the minister and say, there's been a fatality accident, so-and-so's, could you go over there? And the family called, and everybody was having trouble getting in, but it was before 911. All these people are, calling the dispatcher, and the family, mom or whatever, called and said, I heard the sirens, and my two boys are, and now that was different, not this, okay, but call, was, and the dispatcher couldn't get a line out to call the minister and get him over there right away and everything. It was, but I think I got kind of sidetracked here again. Oh no, I want to get to. Okay, that's the answer to that question. How did your first traffic stop go? My first time as a, reserve police officer was that. That happened. The dispatcher did a fantastic job. I didn't mess anything up. But the brother, by the way, anyway, I went to the house, and they came to the door. That probably was not a good sign for them. And I said, there's been an accident, and I was told to come over and tell you that your son is being taken to St. Joseph Hospital. Not the satellites one at 150 Highway and 71 Highway, but the main St. Joseph Hospital at such and such. And that's where you need to go. And then the mother said, our two sons are together. And I said, I was just told to come and tell you, that your son was being taken. And so, and they right away left. And I sat there for a little bit thinking, I wish I could have, done this differently or whatever. But I knew, working hospital security for all those years, I knew, I did not want to say, well, when your son's dead and or anything like that. And I did tell him. I said, now, drive carefully, But so I'm going to do this from time to time. And this is an interesting one. How would a police officer treat a probationary officer pulled over for speeding? Not that so much. I'll change it a little bit, how what I would do when I stopped, a police officer, and you probably think you know the answer. Well, you probably do know the answer, but I can add a little information to it, like when I was stopped, the times that I was stopped by a police officer, and the times that I stopped, police officers for speeding. Okay, oh God, 48 minutes, I'm sorry. I'll handle this differently next time, but I have some stories too. And this will be what I use, because I want you guys to they have a lot of good questions. Questions I would prefer to rather be asked than How do you get Windows 11 to work with a Clyde Hopper or something, something, that I don't know and don't really care, So anyway, thank you very much for watching.